모던 루디먼트 스윙 솔로, 더울 아메리칸 드러머, 리스트 앤 핑거 스트로크 컨트롤. 드럼 좀 친다 하는 분들이면 한 번쯤 들어봤을 법한 드럼 교재 이름입니다. 앞서 말씀드린 이 교재들은 해외 드러머들한테는 바이블처럼 여겨지고 있는데요. 드럼을 처음 시작하거나 특히 드럼을 전공하는 분들이라면 더더욱 몰라서는 안 되겠죠. 자, 뉴올리언즈 출신 드러머인 스탠턴 무어가 이 책의 저자인 드러머 찰스 윌콕슨에 대해서 간단히 소개하고 이 모던 루디먼트 스윙 솔로 교재가 세상에 나오게 된 일화, 그리고 이 책에 나오는 솔로들을 연습하는 것이 얼마나 중요한지 설명해 줄 겁니다. 참고로 모던 루디먼트 스윙 솔로 교재는 네이버 카페 유캔드럼에 오시면 무료로 다운로드 하실 수 있고요. 카페 주소는 댓글란에 적혀 있는 링크를 클릭하시면 바로 이동이 가능합니다. 자, 그럼 영상 한번 보시죠.
Charles Wilcoxon was a rudimental, he was a classical drummer, legit drummer. So he fell in love with the playing of Gene Krupa, Buttigieg, and Louis Bellson. And he would invite those guys to come over when they were passing through Ohio, and he would play with them. He would listen to them play. Then he started writing snare drum etudes based out of the vocabulary they were playing. So that book was written,
First edition is 1945, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the 40s. Yeah, and it's what is it? Swing solos. I'm going to space on it. I carry it with me all the time, and but the actual name of it is Modern Rudimental Swing Solos, I think. But that book that's the book that after it was written in the 40s, Philly Joe carried it around in his back pocket, and developed a lot of his modern rudimental swing solos, right? That's the name of it. So Philly Joe carried it around in his back pocket and shed it all the time and he improvised on all that and let it become his vocabulary. But that book was written coming from jazz vocabulary. He wrote the book, and then it got turned into more jazz vocabulary via Philly Joe. And then whether guys realize it or not, but if you're playing stuff like this, I just had the brushes in my hands, right? But you're playing stuff like this, that's the first 4 bars of the, oh man, I'm spacing the name of it, but the single drag one that right. That to me it's just got so much vocabulary in there,
right?
And then Roughing the Single Drag, right? And it's dedicated to Louis Bellson. That's the name of the solo. But there's so many bits in there where you could play it verbatim, and it sounds like Philly Joe, and then you improvise with it, right? So here's the piece. Here's the first measure. That's not even improvising with it. Once we start improvising with it, and then start tripletizing the drags.
Right.
Turning them more into triplets. And I'm just improvising with those ideas in those first 4 bars of that Charles Wilcoxon Roughing the Single Drag. And it works in swing, it works in funk,
But a lot of that stuff, like, is it meant to play a little swung, the Wilcoxon solos? Some of them are, some of them
it depends
not.
on who you talk to.
Right. Right. There are a lot of families, like how people explain that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was very fortunate to get a couple lessons with Kenny Washington. Kenny wants you to not swing it, and he wants you to play it super, super quiet, super controlled, loop one measure over and over and over,
Right.
and try to make it, every time you loop it, make it quieter and more perfect, and close those diddles, right? And he doesn't want you to play it like Philly Joe. He wants you to play it like a world-class rudimental drummer at a very low volume. You know, he turned me on to the Frank Arsenault records. Frank Arsenault was a rudimental champion, and you listen to it's a record of him breaking down the rudiments, but it's like so unbelievably clean and precise. And it's like, so by developing that kind of finesse, by practicing that stuff so quietly, it helps with your finesse on the drums and your volume control when you're playing with a piano trio or playing in a jazz context. So the rudimental stuff, I was brought up on all that, but not all of the rudimental vocabulary and lexicon makes sense on the drums. A lot of the Wilcoxon stuff is written to make sense on the drums, and once you go back and check that stuff out and then start transcribing Philly Joe Jones, you're like, you can hear Philly Joe play something, and you can see not only on the page what it would be if you would transcribe it, but you can see the stickings, you know? So if you hear, he's not going, he's doing it hand to hand. And then when he splits it around, then it makes sense. You're like, oh yeah, I got it. And when he does this, he's not going, he's going hand to hand. And then once you start to realize all those things, they start to jump out at you like words when you're reading a book. And when you're hearing this stuff, it starts to jump out at you where you're like, oh, I would know how to write down that word. Just like when you and I talk and you tell me something, I'm not thinking about every individual letter that makes up that word. You tell me a sentence, I'm like, oh, I know all those words. And if you ask me to write them down, well, sure, I could do that. When you start checking this stuff out on that level, then this stuff starts jumping out at you. You're like, oh, like you'll read some, you'll work on some of the Wilcoxon stuff and be like, wait a minute, this is just like that Philly Joe solo I was checking out. That's where Philly Joe got it from, and vice versa. You're checking out Philly Joe and you're like, wait a minute, I know what that is. And you can see how he's doing it.